welcome back to my channel. My name is Jessica, and today I'm doing a video all about the palette that made me break my no-buy. Darn it. If you've been following my channel so far, you know that I am on a mission to reduce my makeup inventory. I have an incredibly large makeup collection for my life, in my opinion, and I'm trying to shrink it down. And so I'm really making an effort not to bring in new products this year. Replacing products is different, but as far as bringing in new products that I really don't need, I'm really trying to put a stop on that. Well, unfortunately, here we are, the end of March, and I failed. I did fail my no-buy, but I think it's for a pretty good palette. This palette, when it came out, I was absolutely just in love. It's so adorable. Colourpop was having a sale, and I had been eyeing this palette for quite some time. I am a huge Disney fan, and I love all things Disney and all things adorable. The palette that I'm talking about, the palette that made me break my no-buy challenge for 2021, was none other than the Child palette from Colourpop. And I mean, come on, can you blame me? Look at this adorable face. How could you say no? Of all of the Disney collabs with Colourpop, and there have been quite a few, this has definitely been the only one that tempted me to the point of purchasing. Of course, it's Baby Grogu that's gonna make me fall in love with the Colourpop Disney collab. And let's take a look at what it looks like inside. You can see it is a really cute palette, has some really beautiful shades, quite an interesting color story. Greens are very popular right now, and I think it really does capture the essence of little Baby Grogu. And while this is a beautiful palette with some beautiful shades, I was pretty sure that I had these shades in my collection already, so I'll admit it. I purchased this palette 100% solely for the adorable packaging alone. And you know what? I do not regret it, because it does bring me a little joy every time I see it on my vanity and I get to pick it up. And I haven't used it on my eye yet, but it's been super fun playing with it today, and I can't wait to put it on my eyeballs. So let me know if you'd be interested in seeing a makeup look with this palette. But for today, instead, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at my makeup collection and finding dupes for these shades, the closest dupes that I possibly can. And we'll see, did I really need to buy this palette? And I think we already know the answer to that question, or at least I think I already know the answer. Jessica, you have enough eyeshadow. But I thought it would be fun to just go through my collection and verify what I already know, and have that be a reminder to me to maybe resist the temptation next time, even if the packaging is this cute. And hopefully no other companies come out with a Baby Yoda palette, because obviously he seems to be my weak point. Can't blame me, can you? I mean, look at him. Look at him, he's so cute. He's my kryptonite. This little guy, this little green guy. Hopefully no other Grogu palettes come out onto the market, because clearly I cannot help myself. Well, without further ado, let's get into those dupes and see what we can find in my collection. The first shade that we're trying to dupe is Precious Cargo, and it is this shade right here. It will always be the first shade on my wrist for this video. This is what I found in my collection to compare it to. Again, this is Precious Cargo. This is from a Lorac palette. It is in the shade, it's the Lorac Mega Pro 2, and it's the shade Moonlight. This is the shade in Light from the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette. This is the shade Trust Issues from the Jackie Aina Anastasia Beverly Hills palette. This is the shade Fairy from the ABH Soft Glam palette. This is a Super Shock shadow from Colourpop, and it is in the shade, Tassel. This is Nectar from the Too Faced Sweet Peach palette. This is that greenish iridescent shade that's in the Take Me Back to Brazil palette, and this is the white highlight shade that's in that same palette. So looking at these, I think, you know, this one's obviously not nearly as sparkly as Precious Cargo. This one is way too white. This one is pretty dead on. This is the Trust Issues shade from Anastasia Beverly Hills Jackie Aina palette, and you can see they're both pretty glittery, and they both kind of have the same reflect, like a greenish gold. I think that is pretty spot on. Fairy from the Soft Glam palette is just too gold. This one, Tassel, the Super Shock Shadow, is too silver. This one is just too dull and white. That was the Nectar shade from Sweet Peach. And then these two, I think, just don't have the sparkle factor. I think of the two, this one would be a little bit closer. Maybe if you mix those two, the green and the whitish shade, you'd get a kind of a better tone. But I think these two are definitely our winners. So my dupe in my collection, pretty spot on, is Precious Cargo and Trust Issues. And there they are right next to each other. On the left, we have Trust Issues, and on the right, we have Precious Cargo. I would say Precious Cargo is a teensy bit more green, where Trust Issues is a teensy bit more gold. But overall, I think it's pretty close, and I wasn't expecting to find something that close in my collection. So there you go. I already had this shade, pretty much. All right, the next shade we're duping here is Right Hand Mando. And of course, it is this shade here. And it's very like silvery taupe with like a green shift to it, in my opinion. It's kind of hard to explain. So this is what I came up with to try and dupe it with. We have Dwolas here, again from the Jackie Aina ABH palette. This is El Malecon from the Reina del Caribe palette from Alamar Cosmetics. This shade here is Olivine from the Lorac Mega Pro 2 palette. And then this shade here is a greenish, brownish shade from the Take Me Back to Brazil palette. And definitely none of these are exact dupes. I would say, looking at it on camera, that Olivine is probably the closest match. It's kind of got that taupey feel to it with a slight green undertone, and they kind of El Malecon is also really close, but it's more green. It's a lot more green, I think. So yeah, I'll swatch those next to each other, see if I can get a more accurate idea. I feel like if I mix these two together, it would just be spot on Right Hand Mando. I think I'm actually going to call El Malecon the closest dupe in my collection because it just has more of a green undertone, where this I feel really does pull brown. And I think in the overall scheme, color scheme of the palette, this will give us more of the overall effect of the palette. Now that I have them side by side, I actually like this dupe even more. On the left, we have the Reina del Caribe shade El Malecon from the Alamar Cosmetics palette. And on the right, we have Right Hand Mando from the Child palette. I almost ran out of arm space on this one. We're trying to dupe Just Like a Tatooine, this shade here. As you can see, I definitely have a lot of very close dupes in my collection. This first shade here is MFEO from the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette. This shade is Tawny from the Lorac Mega Pro 2 palette. Here I have Burnt Orange from the ABH Soft Glam palette, and it's also in the Modern Renaissance palette. This shade is Ludwig from the Kat Von D Shade and Light Eye palette. Here I have Beach from the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. This is Sora from the Makeup Geek Manu MUA palette. So you can see these are all pretty stinking close. Looking at them on my arm, I think the closest, I would say, gosh, it's really hard. They're very, very close. This shade's just a little bit more pink. This shade's pretty close. This shade's a little bit deeper. Burnt Orange is a teensy bit deeper. That one also is very, very close. Ludwig, but I think this one's a little bit more peachy and lighter in color. This one is also very close. The Beach color from the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. I think this one might be a teensy bit, oh god, that one's very close too. I actually think the closest one might be Tawny. Oh my god, they're all so close. Well, long story short, yes, I can dupe this shade. I think as long as we know that, then that's enough information probably. Here's the Natasha Denona shade on the left in the shade called Beach. And on the right, we have Just Like a Tatooine. And I don't know, for some reason they don't look as close as they did, but I still think they're a pretty close dupe. And obviously I have lots of warm, neutral transition shades in my collection. That is a no-brainer there. We're looking at Sipping Soup here, the 4th shade in the Child palette right here. And I basically went through all the greens in my collection and found some pretty close ones, I think. So right here, this is Rosé All Day by Colourpop. I think that's the right name. That's what it says on the back of the pan, but it's an individual I ordered, and it doesn't look like a color that should be called Rosé All Day, but nevertheless, there it is. Pretty close, I think, just more of like a yellowy green. This is Bless Her Heart from the Sweet Peach palette, definitely way too dark. This is Sponsored from the ABH Jackie Aina palette, which definitely is too dark. It's more of that like brownie shift of a green, so that one didn't quite work. This is El Malecon again from the Reina del Caribe palette from Alamar Cosmetics, and I hate to say it, but it is actually pretty close to Sipping Soup as well. I would say it's a nice in-between between Precious Cargo and Sipping Soup. This shade here is from the Colourpop Paradise palette, and that shade is called Mary Jane. Love the name, but it's definitely much more of a yellow lime green than our Sipping Soup shade. This green here is from the e.l.f. Jalapeno palette, and then this green is from the Take Me Back to Brazil palette. None of these shades are an exact dupe, but I'm going to say our closest is between this one here, this shade Rosé All Day from Colourpop, or the shade Jalapeno from the e.l.f. palette. Looking at them in the light and considering the overall color scheme of this palette, I'm going to call our closest dupe this one here, Rosé All Day from Colourpop. And hopefully that's the right name of the shade. And there they are side by side. On the right this time, we have Sipping Soup, the Colourpop, the Child palette shade. And on the right, we have Rosé All Day, a Colourpop single. And not surprising that 2 Colourpop shades are so similar. Woo! This was a pretty straightforward duping here. All 3 of these shades are Colourpop shades. The first shade being, of course, from our Baby Yoda palette, the Child palette, and it is in the shade Baby Face. And I think right next to it is Checkmate, which is a Colourpop single shade that I have. Obviously very attracted to this color. And this shade here is Lookin' Fresh from the Paradise palette from Colourpop. So 3 Colourpop shades, 3 mint green shades, and I would say these 2 are twins pretty much. So I'm gonna call that my dupe. So we have Baby Face from the Child palette, and its immediate dupe there is, again, another shade from Colourpop, Checkmate. All right, here we go with the Force. The Force is this shade here. It's a pretty unique gold considering how many golds I have in my collection. This is how I did as far as duping them goes. Let's see if I can remember all of these shades. This is the shade Bronze from the Anastasia Beverly Hills Soft Glam palette. This is Dwalas from the ABH Jackie Aina palette. This is the gold shade from the e.l.f. Jalapeno palette, and it's kind of a greeny gold. This is the shade Gold Leaf from the Lorac Makeup Pro 2 palette. This is the shade Chocolate Gold from the Too Faced Chocolate Gold palette. This is the shade Cat Eye from the Winky Lux Kitten palette. This is Alloy from the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. And last but not least, I just threw this in for good measure. This is the shade Queen from the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette. So you can see a lot of golds in my collection, but none of them are quite exactly the same as the Force. I'm going to look at these in the sunshine and see if I can figure it out. I think after looking at them in the sun, the closest shade is actually Dwalas. It's like kind of that greenish hue, and it's got a good amount of sparkle to it. Chocolate Gold is a close second, but I think it's just a little bit too yellow. So yeah, I'm going to call Dwalas from Jackie Aina's ABH palette the best winner in my collection. We're trying to dupe Little Frog here, this shade here, and it is pretty much a matte, but it does have a little silver shimmer in there. And the first one I tried to dupe it with was from the Too Faced Sweet Peach palette in Bless Her Heart. Definitely too deep, too shimmery. This is the matte green shade from the Jalapeno palette from e.l.f. This is the shade Up and Up. It's a single shade from Colourpop, and definitely, again, too shimmery. And this shade is from the Take Me Back to Brazil palette, a shimmery green. And hands down, without doubt, the best dupe in my collection is from the e.l.f. Jalapeno palette right there. So that is my dupey dupe. I would say when they're side by side, they're not quite as close as when lined up with all the other shades, but I think overall the effect would be the same on the eye, and that's what I'm calling my closest dupe. Okay, the second to last shade in the palette is called Float Your Crib, and it is this matte green. It's like almost a khaki green or an army green, and I didn't quite have that shade of green in my collection, but we did have some matte deep greens that I used as potential dupes. So for the first shade we have is from the Lorac Mega Pro 2 palette, and it is in the shade Forest, a nice deep hunter green shade. And then we have from the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette the shade Enchanted, very similar to Forest, and another deep green color. And then the last green is from the e.l.f. Jalapeno palette, and it is the deepest shade of green in that palette. And I think the best dupe we have is from the Lorac Mega Pro 2, that shade Forest, just because it's not quite as deep as the other two, and I feel like it has more of that like army dingy green quality to it that Float Your Crib has. So we're gonna call that one our dupe today. Okay, and the last shade is Droid Protocol, this first shade on my arm. So as you can see, there is no shortage of warm, deep browns in my collection. So these are the dupes that I found. I bet you there were more, but I got tired of searching. So here we have the shade from the Colourpop The Child palette. It's called Droid Protocol, and it's kind of a warm tone, deep brown, obviously. And then duping it, next to it we have Cherry Cola from Makeup Geek. The shade is Insomnia from the Makeup Geek Manny MUA palette. This is Chip from the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette. Here we have Cabernet from the Lorac Mega Pro 2 palette. This shade here is Jupiter from the Ciate Glitter Storm palette. And this last shade here is Cypress Umber from the Anastasia Beverly Hills Modern Renaissance palette. Now, definitely some close dupes here, some closer than others. Looking at it without the light, just my naked eye, not through the camera, I think the closest shade is this one here, the shade Chip from, I think Chip from the Jaclyn Hill Morphe palette is the closest. And there they are. Those are my dupes. Not bad, I don't think. So here we have Trust Issues from the Jackie Aina ABH palette. We have El Malacon from the Alamar Cosmetics Reina del Caribe palette. Here we have Beach from the Natasha Denona Bronze palette. This is Rose All Day, a Colourpop single. Here we have Checkmate, another Colourpop single. This shade is Up and Up, another one from Colourpop, another single from Colourpop. This is that matte green shade from the e.l.f. Jalapeno palette. Here we have Forest from the Lorac Mega Pro 2. And last but not least, we have Chip from the Jackie Aina Morphe palette. And you know, it's not bad. I definitely confirmed that I didn't need to buy this palette, but you know what? The packaging alone made it worth it. So what are you gonna do? Well, we did it, just like we suspected we would. Now we know that we really do have quite an extensive collection of eyeshadows, something we already knew. And I just wanted to, again, remind myself that even if the packaging's cute, even if the palette has this color story that really calls to me and brings me to want to buy this palette, I know that I really probably don't need it. So Hopefully my no-buy will go further throughout the year and go strong as we continue through this year. We are in April, so I think buying one palette in 4 months of a no-buy is not too bad. And I was going to give myself, you know, at least one kind of place to indulge if I wanted to. So that was the Grogu palette, and you know, maybe my birthday I'll treat myself for something if I get like a gift card, but other than that, the plan is not to bring in new items into my collection for the remainder of 2021. So stick along with me on this journey and see how I do in the rest of my year in my project panning projects and my Pan Those Eyeshadows project, and follow me along as I move through my challenges and through my collection this year as we shrink down my inventory. Hope you enjoyed seeing me dupe the Child palette from Colourpop and seeing what shades I could dig out of my collection. Grogu and I want to say thank you for watching this video, and we appreciate you liking it and subscribing and coming back for more. And from Grogu and I, we would just like to say, may the Force be with you. Bye!